can impose these 4 chords over roots to make more interesting colors. It's important to, I think, check out Isaac Raz's great 10-chord routine video, which will be in one of the slides. The major 6 diminished is something that we can use as the important minor of a chord. So I'm going to take this C major 6, play it in a different voicing over an A. Now this becomes the important minor of a D7, which is going to resolve to a G major 7. And this is how we think of a 2-5-1 in Barry Harris's method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the root to D and I'm going to lower 1 note. And then I'm going to resolve to G major 6. And there's your 2-5-1. Why do we do that? Why does it work? Let's lower another note and see. So the function of this 2-5-1 is to transition to a diminished chord. Hopefully you heard it. That's a diminished over a D. And this diminished is the diminished of a G major 6. G major 6 diminished. But we play it over D. And we don't always play this note. We may borrow other notes around it. And that's how we resolve to a G major 6. We'll get into some other applications later, hopefully. We can also make what's called the pretty one. We can play C major 6 like this, but we can also play C major this way, with the major 6 built on the 5. And that's going to sound like, let's play it like that. And you can resolve that nicely using the flat 3 diminished that we talked about. Another thing that we can do is we can use C minor 6 to make a half diminished chord. Now we're going to resolve to G minor 6. Kind of interesting. So before we took a major 6 with the 6 in the bass, the 6th in the bass, and we were able to resolve to another major 6 chord. Here we do that with a minor 6. It's a minor 6 with the 6th in the bass, and we use it to resolve to a different G minor 6 chord. Let's look at 2 dominants that we can use here. Let's play this over B, the C minor 6 over B, and resolve it a little, or voice it a little bit differently so that it sounds a little bit better. Now we have B altered right here. What if we play this over F? Okay. Voice it that way. We have a nice F7. Well, what if we borrow a diminished note from this C minor 6? Now we have F7 sharp 11. Really nice. Let's look at improvisation, how Barry starts you on improvisation. He's going to use 3 scales. The major scale, what he calls the dominant scale, and the minor scale. Sorry. Depending on how you impose these over roots, they can also be used to group chords and function in a really interesting way. So for example, major is used over the 1, the 3, and the 6. I sometimes use it over 4. It has different colors depending on how you play it. Minor can be played over 6 if that's a chord that you're resolving to. You'd use the major if it's an important minor of a dominant, but if you're resolving to minor, you would use, let's use this, the A minor scale. Dominant you would use over the 5, a 2-5, you can also use it over 7. And if you lower 1 note, you can also use it over 3, going to 6. So if this is a good time to move along to the next slide, but I can get into these concepts a little more deeply here and explain a little more of my thinking, a little more of hopefully Barry's thinking on these things. What's interesting here is with the improvisation, let's start there. We don't have a different chord scale or a different arpeggio or a different lick that we're, again, plugging in on a chord symbol. Rather, we're starting to think more holistically. We're starting to think in bigger groups of chords and functions. For example, 1, 3, and 6 can all have the same function, and you can apply the same scale to them. Likewise with the chords. You can start to apply one chord, depending on function, to many different situations. Like we talked about how this C major 6, it can be an A minor that's resolving, let's say, to a G6. But it could also be a C6 that you resolve to. Or it could also be a pretty voicing of an F major 7. Same with the minor 6 chords. We can play it like C minor 6. We can also play it like A half diminished. We could also play this like an F7, a kind of F7. What's really interesting though is the way that you're able to voice lead a little more cleanly. So I'm just showing you these sort of static, plugged in. But you're going to see in the following examples how you can harmonize notes